Laura thought Ricardo had abandoned her because he'd stopped loving her. For 3 years, she carried the pain of his sudden disappearance, wondering what she'd done wrong. When he finally returned, pale and haunted, she wanted to hate him for the heartbreak he'd caused. But the truth he carried was darker than abandonment could ever be. He hadn't left because he didn't love her. He'd left because his family had committed a crime that destroyed her childhood, and he'd spent years gathering evidence to finally give her the justice she never knew she deserved. 3 years ago, Laura's world had been perfect. She was 24, deeply in love with Ricardo, planning their future together. They talked about marriage, the small house they wanted to buy, the children they hoped to have. Ricardo was everything she dreamed of. Kind, thoughtful, completely devoted to her happiness. Then, one ordinary Tuesday morning, he simply vanished. No explanation, no goodbye, no forwarding address. Laura woke up to find his apartment empty, his phone disconnected, his job abandoned. It was as if Ricardo had never existed, except for the devastating hole his absence left in her heart. For months, Laura searched desperately. She contacted friends, coworkers, relatives, but no one knew anything. The most painful possibility was the one she eventually accepted. Ricardo had decided he didn't want to be with her, and had chosen the cruelest way to end their relationship. Laura spent 3 years rebuilding her life. She threw herself into work as a social worker, helping families navigate crisis situations. The irony was unlost on her that she helped others heal from trauma while her own heart remained shattered. She had her own painful history. Laura had grown up in foster care after her parents died in a house fire. When she was 8, authorities ruled it faulty electrical wiring. The official report stated both parents died from smoke inhalation, and she survived only because she'd been staying at a friend's house. This tragedy shaped her life, leaving her with deep abandonment fears that Ricardo's disappearance intensified. On a rainy Thursday evening in November, Laura was leaving her office when she saw a familiar figure under the streetlight. Her heart stopped. Even after 3 years, she would recognize Ricardo anywhere. Ricardo looked terrible. His skin was pale, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, his clothes hanging loose as if he'd lost significant weight. Most disturbing was his expression, filled with profound guilt and anguish that made Laura almost feel sorry for him, before she remembered the pain he'd caused. "Laura," he said softly, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I know I have no right to be here. I don't deserve even a minute of your time." "You're right," Laura replied coldly, despite her racing heart. "You don't." 3 years, Ricardo. 3 years without a word. "Do you have any idea what you put me through?" "I do," he whispered, tears forming in his eyes. "I know exactly what I put you through because I've lived with the guilt every single day. But Laura, I need you to know I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I discovered something that would have destroyed both our lives if I'd stayed." Against her better judgment, Laura found herself listening. There was something in his voice. Desperation and sincerity. It cut through her anger and reached the part that had never stopped loving him. Ricardo explained that 3 years ago, he'd been going through his late grandfather's belongings when he discovered a box of old documents hidden in the attic. Among them were newspaper clippings, police reports, and handwritten notes revealing a devastating truth. His grandfather and uncle had been involved in an arson scheme decades ago, targeting families for insurance fraud. "The house fire that killed your parents," Ricardo said, his voice breaking. "It wasn't an accident, Laura. My grandfather and uncle were hired to burn down houses and make it look like electrical problems. Your parents' house was one of them." Laura felt the world spinning. The official story of her parents' death, the tragic accident that orphaned her, had been a lie. They had been murdered for money, and the man she loved was related to their killers. "I found everything," Ricardo continued through tears. "Documents proving the arson, records of payment, even photos of your house before and after the fire. My grandfather died shortly after I found the evidence, but my uncle was still alive, still free, still profiting from his crimes." Ricardo had faced an impossible choice: tell Laura the truth and destroy her world, or disappear and find a way to get justice without involving her in the devastating revelation. He chose to leave, spending 3 years gathering evidence, working with investigators, building a case strong enough to bring his uncle to justice. "I couldn't ask you to carry this burden," he said. "I couldn't keep living with you while hiding that my family destroyed yours. So I left, even though it killed me, and spent every day since working to make it right." Laura stared at the photographs of her childhood home, pictures taken before the fire, showing the beautiful little house where she'd spent the first 8 years of her life with parents who had loved her deeply. There were also crime scene photos that the police had never shown her, revealing evidence of accelerant that had been ignored in the original investigation. "Your parents weren't just random targets," Ricardo said, his voice barely audible. "Your father had been investigating corruption in the local construction industry. He'd uncovered a network of contractors who were cutting corners on electrical work and then burning down houses to cover their tracks. He was going to expose everything, so they decided to silence him permanently." The cruelest irony was that Laura's parents had died trying to protect other families from the same fate that ultimately befell them. They had been heroes, not victims of random misfortune. Ricardo had spent 3 years not only gathering evidence, but also tracking down other families who had been targeted by the same scheme. He'd worked with lawyers, private investigators, and federal authorities to build a case that would finally bring justice to all the victims. "I turned in all the evidence last week," Ricardo said. "My uncle was arrested yesterday on multiple counts of arson and murder. The case is going to trial, and you'll finally get the answers you deserve about what really happened to your parents." Laura felt overwhelmed by a mixture of grief, rage, and vindication. The tragedy that had defined her entire life had finally been revealed as the crime it really was. Her parents hadn't died because of faulty wiring. They had died because they were good people trying to protect others, and evil people had silenced them. But perhaps most devastating of all was the realization that Ricardo had sacrificed their relationship and his own happiness to give her this gift of truth and justice. He had loved her so much that he'd been willing to let her hate him rather than burden her with the knowledge of what his family had done. "I know this doesn't change anything between us," Ricardo said, preparing to leave. "I know you can never forgive me for keeping this from you, for leaving you the way I did. But I needed you to know that your parents were heroes, and that the people who killed them are finally going to pay for what they did." Laura stood in the rain for a long time after Ricardo walked away, holding the box of evidence that would reshape everything she thought she knew about her life. The 8-year-old girl who had lost her parents could finally understand that their deaths had meaning. They had died fighting for justice, trying to protect other families from harm. Over the following weeks, as the criminal case unfolded, Laura learned more about her parents than she'd ever known. They had been investigators, activists, people who had dedicated their lives to exposing corruption and protecting the innocent. Laura realized that her own career as a social worker was no coincidence. It was her parents' legacy living on through her. The trial brought closure that Laura had never expected to find. Ricardo's uncle was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The other families who had lost loved ones in similar fires finally got answers and justice. And Laura finally understood why her parents' deaths had always felt different from a simple accident, because they hadn't been an accident at all. 2 months after the trial ended, Laura found Ricardo sitting on a bench in the park where they used to walk together. He looked surprised to see her, but also hopeful in a way that made her heart ache. "I've been thinking," Laura said, sitting down beside him, "da-da-da-da-da, about choices and sacrifices, and what love really means. You could have told me the truth 3 years ago, and let me carry that burden with you. Instead, you carried it alone so I wouldn't have to. That wasn't abandonment, Ricardo. That was the most selfless act of love I've ever witnessed." The reunion wasn't simple or immediate. Too much pain had passed between them for that. But they began the slow work of rebuilding trust and healing together, united now by truth instead of separated by secrets. Sometimes love means walking away to protect the person you care about most, even when it breaks your own heart. Ricardo's story reminds us that the greatest acts of love often require the greatest sacrifices, that justice sometimes demands we choose truth over comfort. Laura learned that her parents were heroes, that the man she loved had been willing to become a villain in her eyes, rather than burden her with his family's crimes. If this story moved you and made you think about the hidden sacrifices people make for love, subscribe for more stories that explore the complex choices that define our humanity. Share this with someone who believes love is worth fighting for.